Good morning, friends. Today we will try to complete our discussion about individual and society in classical sociology, ably represented by Emile Durkheim, Karl Marx, and Max Weber. Yesterday I discussed about the Greek concept of society, but I referred only to the city-state of Athens. During the same time, there were two other important city-states in Greece, namely Athens we have discussed, Sparta, and Macedonia. Now, there was a competition between Athens and Sparta. Macedonia was more or less neutral, but the Macedonian princes, including Alexander the Great, were students of the academy, which was informally founded by Socrates, then ably managed by his student Plato. Now, when Aristotle succeeded Plato, Alexander was one of his favorite students. Now, what is the basic difference between Sparta and Athens? In case you are familiar with Indian history, during the same time, there were two important states in India, namely Magad and Vaishali. Now, what is the basic difference between Sparta and Athens? The difference is this, that Athens was a republic like Vaishali in ancient India, and Sparta was a monarchy like Magad of ancient India. Now, these two concepts of republic and monarchy present two ideal types of society and individual. Now, in a republic, in contemporary terms, you can call it democracy. But then you must understand the difference between the Greek society on the one hand and Indian society on the other in ancient times, the citizen or the members of the republic in ancient Greece had some private property. In other words, in ancient Athens and Sparta and Macedonia, everybody who was a resident of the republic or monarchy was not called the citizen. Citizenship was linked with the ownership of property. Therefore, when we discuss about democracy, we discuss about republic, we must take into account the major difference between Europe and Asia in particular. And I'm talking before the three Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam came into existence. Indian Vedic society, according to G.S. Ghurye, the Indian sociologist, as well as William Weiser, Henry Maine, the European sociologist of Indian society, as well as the historian Megasthenes, who lived in the reign of Chandragupta Maurya, and his teacher Chanakya or Kautilya. He has written a book called Indica when he was in Magadha Empire. When you compare the Indica of the Greek historian Megasthenes, you come across the difference between Republic of Vaishali and the monarchy of Magad. In the same way, when you read the Greek historian Herodotus, you come across the Republic of Athens and the monarchy of Sparta. Now, the main point for you people is the concept of community and the concept of society in Athens and Sparta, as well as Vaishali and Magadha. The major difference, as a responsible student of the major Greek text about India and Greece, I will summarize the sociological salient feature of Sparta and Athens by using the term Ferdinand Tönnies used in the title of his book. namely community and society. In other words, before Ferdinand Tönnies, we had a different concept of man and a different concept of society. And Tönnies is the first major sociologist, first major theorist who had very clearly outlined the similarities and differences between Sparta and Athens on the one hand, and Germany and England on the other. Now, deliberately, there is a silence about France before migration of Karl Marx from Germany to France and then to England. The major reason of this silence about France is neither the French Enlightenment of 18th century nor the French Revolution, which began in 1765 and ended in 1783. Now, why these dates are important? Because most people do not try to bring in the rise and fall of Napoleon as the main representative of the French Revolution. Why? Because somehow or the other, European scholars suffer from a civilizational superiority over the non-Europeans. And once they refer to the violent French Revolution or the violent American War of Independence and the violent First and Second World Wars, their concept of civilization becomes academically, conceptually, historically problematic. Therefore, please keep in mind that there is a history of the terms individual and society, the way it is used in Karl Marx, Max Weber, and Durkheim. And unless and until we contextualize these three theories of man and society in The real history as it happened, it is very difficult to understand the meanings attached in traditional action, rational legal action, or charismatic action of an individual in the sociology of Max Weber. In the same way, unless and until we keep the genealogy of the terms individual, self, person, society, civil society, church, religion, state, or civilization. In Marx as well as Durkheim, we can remember their quotations but cannot understand the technical meaning attached with these terms. Therefore, I will try to draw your attention to some dates in European history which are interesting and insightful for your understanding of the concept we are discussing at the moment, namely the individual in the society. After the Greek city-states, before the invasion of Alexander, first on Persia and then smaller states around, and then to his struggle to occupy northwestern frontier of undivided India. We must refer to another European site, SITE, of civilization, European civilization, European pillar of civilization, namely the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Empire was a very, very mighty empire of Europe. And from the common era that is, after the birth of Jesus Christ, it is called common era or AD, after Christ. A, after the death of Christ. Before that, we have BC, before Jesus Christ or before the death of Jesus Christ. During the Common Era, the Roman Empire had roughly subjugated all the geographical areas of Western Europe, and they had alliances with people of northern Europe as well, the way East India Company occupied, conquered large parts of undivided India. But even then, there were about 600 princely estates in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, which had military alliance with the East India Company. Now, the East India Company and then later the British Empire was modeled on the French Empire under Napoleon. I think you know that although French Revolution is remembered in history for overthrowing the monarchy existing in France before 1765. But you must remember also that by 1789, the French Revolution died down. And there emerged a military dictator called Napoleon Bonaparte, who ruled for some years as the military commander with some other commanders, but within a decade he proclaimed himself to be the emperor, more powerful than the emperor of France, who was dethroned by the French Revolutionary. Now the same thing happened in Soviet Union. Vladimir Lenin, influenced by Friedrich Engels, the long companion of Karl Marx, who had already died in 1883. Therefore, the Russian Revolution of 1917 was led by Vladimir Lenin, who was living in England because he was opposed to Tsar Nicholas, and his mentor was Friedrich Engels, the companion of Karl Marx, the friend of Karl Marx. Now what happened? Lenin died very soon, and there was power struggle in Soviet Union between Trotsky and Stalin. Stalin became like Napoleon. He did not claim himself Union, but he behaved in the same way. His social action was the same, which was the social action of Napoleon Bonaparte. Now what I am trying to say is that there is a formal concept of society and formal concept of individual. In the same way, there is a formal concept of democracy and formal concept of dictatorship and monarchy, but the substantive concept is historically determined, and that is taken into account in the writings of at least Emile Durkheim and Karl Marx very, very explicitly. Implicitly, it is also there in Max Weber, but it is so implicit that it is not very easy to understand and read. Now, what is that finer distinction between the Weber's concept of individual and society on the one hand and the Marxian and Durkheimian concept of individual and society on the other? I will say the difference is very, very qualitative, very, very major, very, very important. Both Emile Durkheim and Karl Marx, they believed that before modernity, there was no concept of individual person. I am repeating. According to Karl Marx and Emile Durkheim, before modernity, there was no concept of individual person in Europe, at least. Please keep in mind that when Marx was writing or while Durkheim started to write, there was no Asiatic data which can be said authentically available for classification or interpretation. Therefore, much of sociological theory or social theory of Europe is based on two things. One, the concept of community as the elementary member of the society. From where they got it? They got it from Africa. They got it from Australia. Of course, they relied on the secondary sources. No sociologist worth the name before Marshall Moss did any fieldwork in Asia. For example, there was a political scientist. His name is Thomas Hobbes. He is a very popular person who says that man is naughty, brutish and selfish by nature, And unless and until there is a state, ruthless state, man cannot be civilized. Now, one friend is sermonizing me, which is fine for me, that it is Hobbes who gave or defined the concept of individual. Now, this is something which I usually do not like, because unless and until I tell you or you read what is meant by individual and individualism, you should not try to borrow concepts from political science or history or literature. I'm talking about sociology as a very responsible sociology student. I warn all of you, don't, you have every right to ask question and clarification in your tutorial groups. And in case the teaching assistants do not satisfy you, in my class I will share my sociological understanding of the different concepts. Please keep in mind the concept of individual, which Marx and Durkheim explicitly and Max Weber implicitly is discussing, is qualitatively very new, which did not emerge before the third quarter of 18th century. And even during the last quarter of 18th century, this concept of individual was not taken seriously by the majority of sociologists in Europe. Now, what is unique about this concept of individual? Now, you have a very good book written by the French student of Claude Lévi-Strauss. His name is Louis Dumont. He had written two books. One is called Homo Hierarchicus, and the other is called Homo Equinis. In both these books, Louis Dumont had articulated the concept of unique individual, which developed during the last quarter of 18th century in Western Europe. They excluded even the Eastern Europe in it. And they said that it is for the first time in the last quarter of the 18th century that we have a completely new phenomena, that is the cult of the individual. The cult of the individual. What is this cult of the individual? According to Emile Durkheim, in the division of labor in society, he says that in modern society, for which he coined the term organic solidarity, society lives within the individual, but in mechanical solidarity, that is traditional society for Emile Durkheim, the individual lives in society. Polar opposite concept of individual in mechanical as well as organic solidarity. Now, what is common between Marx uh, Friedrich Engels, Emile Durkheim, Levi Strauss, Albert Einstein, Louis Dumont, Sigmund Freud, etc., that they are by birth Jews. They are part of Jewish diaspora. And what makes them a community is the language called Hebrew. Now, Thomas Hobbes was a Christian, Max Weber is a Christian, and modernity in Europe was invented, nourished, developed, and patronized by the Jewish diaspora in Europe and America. Therefore, nobody in my class today, including me, is an individual in the European sense of the term. What is the European concept of individual today? Or what is the European concept of individual since the last quarter of 18th century? That the individual is as autonomous as the society was in tradition. The individual becomes sui generis, sovereign in modernity. The individual in modernity or organic solidarity is autonomous, sovereign, sacred, whereas in mechanical solidarity, the individual in the modern sense is profane. The sacred individual in organic solidarity is normal and sacred, but the same concept of individual in mechanical solidarity becomes pathological and profane. Now, nobody was using the concept of individual in this sense before Emile Durkheim, very explicitly, but also Karl Marx. And I read the quotation. Some of you wrote, some of you did not write, but then it will be uploaded on YouTube and you can watch it again and again so that you make a note of it. Therefore, what differentiates the Marxian and the Durkheimian concept of individual and society is the concept of man as individual. In Hobbes, he is talking about not modern individual, he is talking about the commonsensical term individual, which was neither only wrong but unethical. If Thomas Hobbes was by nature selfish, naughty, and brutish, it was unethical on his part to overgeneralize his individual nature over other men living in England or Europe. Is it clear to all of you? This is the crux of the division of labor in society, that After Industrial Revolution, there was, for the first time in the history of mankind, division of labor, where one thing was made not by one individual, rather it was made by a group of factory workers. Therefore, suppose there is a pen. Somebody made this, somebody made this, somebody made the refill, and then somebody sold it. Now, what happened in this? The concept of Homo faber, man as the tool-making animal of Karl Marx, was compromised. Earlier, one person was making a pen as the tool of writing. Therefore, he made it. Therefore, he had ownership of this. Therefore, his identity was attached with his production. Now, what is happening? You are not making any product. You are not making any tool. You are not making anything in the market alone. Rather, you are part of the factory system as workers, laborers, and you get wage labor. Marx said, in this sense, man will be alienated from his self as man, and he will be conditioned to rules framed by the factory owners. Durkheim also says the same thing, that this division of labor prevalent in modern factories cannot produce a moral society or moral community or moral individual. Therefore, please keep in mind three concepts. The concept of man as individual is a new development in history of Europe, primarily in the third quarter, but in full-fledged way in the fourth quarter of 18th century. Before the third quarter, nowhere in the world there was this division of labor and this concept of the individual. Therefore, both Marx and Durkheim, they are approaching to the same phenomenon, that is modernity, modern economy, modern state, modern market, and modern society. The only difference is this: Marx is operating with an utopia called the Communist Manifesto in hand. Whereas Emile Durkheim, in the beginning, was not operating with his personal utopia. Rather, he shared the ideals of 18th century French Enlightenment like the other Frenchmen. I am not denying that Emile Durkheim was also against capitalism like Karl Marx. Therefore, there is a similarity between Marx and Durkheim. Both were against this meaningless division of labor in case it is leading to alienation of man from his essence as a tool-making animal, or it is making immoral society and immoral individual. Therefore, ethical concern of Durkheim and Marx forces them to have a concept of moral community and moral society. The same is not true with Max Weber, because he is more concerned with the consumerist society of Western Europe than the concept of moral individual as autonomous being in Durkheim and Marx. As a result, there is a very developed cynicism, pessimism in Max Weber. Max Weber is a very pessimist sociologist. He had a very low opinion about the rise of modernity in Europe. At the end of his career, he was saying that although rise of rational legal bureaucracy is good for the industrial mode of political economy because it promotes the rational organization of space, time, and factory. He is not bothered much about the pathological state of workers because somehow he was more influenced by Charles Darwin theory of evolution than his so-called phenomenological methodology indicates. In other words, Max Weber's epistemology of knowledge about society is analytically independent of his substantive study of society, in other words, ontology of society in history. Therefore, there are two Max Webers, one who wrote the methodology of social sciences and who is credited to write because the work was published after his death by his disciples, called Economy and Society. In the same way, most people think that there are two Karl Marx, one the young Hegelian and second the mature Marx, For example, Capital Volume 1 represented mature Marx, whereas Economic and Philosophical Manuscript of 1848 represented Marx as a German idealist, disciple of Hegel. We will take it up tomorrow. Thank you.